Hello, I'm Jay Shadler. Our first story from 1999 explores how a woman's testimony sent her husband behind bars. He was charged with attacking her and the child she carried in her womb. But when investigators took another look with the help of DNA tests, they found cracks in what had appeared to be an open and shut case.
Soledad Prison, California, one of the toughest. Inside you'll find murderers, rapists, child molesters. Men who will tell you the same thing. They're here by mistake. They're innocent. Kevin Green served 17 years of a life sentence here, and he too swears he didn't commit the crime, beating his pregnant wife and killing their unborn baby.
Your wife contends on that evening you had an argument, you struck her in the head with an object.
That did not happen. We did not have an argument. I did not strike her.
Close it up!
Could Kevin really be an innocent man, locked up by mistake? Listen to his story and judge for yourself. Back in 1979, Kevin was a Marine corporal with a clean and solid record and a beautiful new wife, Diana. This Tustin, California apartment complex, now slated for demolition, was their home. Diana was 9.5 months pregnant and due any day. And here's where Kevin's version of the story becomes both tragic and hard to believe. At 1:30 in the morning, he claims, he got a sudden urge to go out for a cheeseburger, left his wife resting alone in the apartment, and forgot to lock the door.
It took me a little while to get to the Jack in the Box and get my food, but it was about 40 minutes that I was gone.
When he returned, there was Diana, bloody, beaten, and unconscious. Kevin claims someone had slipped in while he was gone and brutally raped her. Diana was rushed to the hospital. Doctors didn't think she'd pull through. But after 3 weeks in a coma, she slowly regained her speech and her memory. But the baby she had carried for 9 months had died in her womb.
What do you remember about that night?
Kevin came in and he wanted sex, and I told him he was crazy. I was 2 weeks past due. Then he punched me on my face. And
He
then
hit you with his fist?
Mm-hmm. And then he reached to the dresser, which was behind him, picked his key caddy, and he hit me. But when he was bringing that down, that was the last thing I saw.
Kevin says that's not true. He claims Diana's head injury left her with a false memory of the evening. But the jury believed Diana and sent Kevin away for life. Yet, did they have all the facts? Because at the same time Kevin stood in judgment, there was something evil going on in the area. A serial rapist and murderer was loose in central Orange County. He was called the bedroom basher. He slipped into homes where women were alone, clubbed them in the head, and then raped them. 5 died. Could the bedroom basher have been waiting outside the Green apartment the night Kevin went out? Could he have attacked Diana? Nobody knew the answer to that question because the bedroom basher had never been caught. For 18 years, photos of his victims remained in the unsolved case files of the Tustin Police Department until a young detective joined the force. Tom Tarpley was specially trained in technology that wasn't even around in 1979, DNA matching. One of the unsolved murders, the rape of Deborah Kennedy, seems similar to the attack of Diana Green that sent husband Kevin to prison.
Now, the Kennedy case was here, and the Green case was here. The closeness of these two cases, I mean, just a few blocks apart. Did that cause you to see the similarity and know that these might be the same guy?
That's what caught my attention. When I looked at the Deborah Kennedy case file, there was mention of the Green case in that as well. And when I looked at the two addresses and how close they were, that's what made me feel in my heart that there was a connection between these two cases.
Could Green be in prison for a crime that was really committed by the serial rapist? Tarpley sends off the old evidence from the unsolved serial crimes, semen specimens.
These are 17 years old.
He's asked the crime lab to analyze the DNA. He's searching for a match with someone already in police files. Tarpley is anxious for the lab results. There is a match. It's Gerald Parker, a burglar who has been in and out of prison for years. And this is Gerald Parker's DNA profile. The lab says it's an exact DNA pattern of the semen from the bedroom basher.
Could you point them out for us, please?
The crime lab results had placed Parker on the scene of 4 unsolved murders of young women.
Now what do we have here?
Parker admits to being the bedroom basher of Orange County, but there's more. Listen carefully. You're about to hear Parker's confession in court, where he admits to breaking into the Green apartment and brutally raping Kevin's pregnant wife, Diana.
Okay, I rushed towards the bed with the weapon in my right hand, and I hit her in the head.
And show me on the table again, not yet.
Okay. She's still breathing, but she's laboring in her breath. Then I realized she was pregnant. I didn't notice. Then I pulled my pants down, and I climbed on top of the bed in between the legs and proceeded to have intercourse.
The semen he left behind was collected in a rape kit, and when tested for DNA years later, would nail down the case. Incredibly, ex-wife Diana still stands by her story and even plans to sue him. She says Kevin knocked her out that night and fled the scene. While she was unconscious, Parker rushed in and raped her.
I know what Kevin did, and I don't know what Parker did. I don't know what he did. I didn't see him, so how do you know which one killed Chantel? I think it's both of them, what they did, killed Chantel.
What's more, Diana says they never had a happy home. She paints Kevin as a young and macho wife beater.
When he drank and he would smoke pot, he would get real violent. One, he had dragged me around the apartment holding my breasts.
If that sounds like the confused thoughts of a brain-injured woman, as Kevin contends, consider this. He admits her depiction of their marriage is not far off.
The stories about abuse on my part, there's enough there to be true, but it wasn't every day, and it wasn't that day.
In 1999, Kevin Green's ex-wife, Diana, continued to stand by her story, and she filed a wrongful death suit against Green. Green's exoneration on murder charges is one of many criminal cases in which DNA has played a vital role. Because it can be expensive, DNA testing is not available to all convicted criminals who think it can prove their innocence. But in some states, that's beginning to change.
I think about these 18 years all the time. I can't get it back.
Dennis Williams spent 18 years on Illinois' death row.
I try not to think about this, but I had at least 3 execution dates set.
Dates that were set after Williams and 3 other men were convicted in the rape and murder of a young couple. The men, who came to be known as the Ford Heights Four, always maintained their innocence.
I wouldn't ever do anything as horrible as murder, as rape, as aggravated kidnap, as armed violence. You know, I'd never do anything like that.
In 1996, science concluded what a jury did not. Their blood and semen did not match evidence found at the crime scene. Williams and his co-defendants were set free. Based on cases like this one, in 1997, Illinois passed the nation's most comprehensive law giving prison inmates the right to DNA testing.
It brings us closer to what the system is supposed to do, and that is determine the truth.
What makes the law even more striking is that it was sponsored by State Senator Ed Petka, a former prosecutor who put 7 people on death row.
This is not going to be a gusher that just pushes people out of prison, because the bill has been carefully designed to ensure that the individuals who are using this procedure are in a position where it can truly help them.
Because increasing numbers of convicted criminals, including death row inmates, have been set free by DNA, many old cases have been getting a new look. Walter Rowe contributed to a Justice Department report entitled "Convicted by Juries, Exonerated by Science."
We've since come to realize that DNA is incredibly stable and can persist not just for decades, but still be detectable hundreds, thousands, and even millions of years later.
For Dennis Williams, who had to fight 18 years for the kind of testing that Illinois now allows, the issue is a simple one. Without DNA testing,
I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now. I'd be in the cemetery decaying now.
he says God and science saved his life.
When I wake up now every morning, the first thing I do silently, is thank God that I'm free.
After a man is sentenced to over 3,000 years in prison, can anything overturn his judgment? The answer when Justice Files returns. Tim Durham spent more than 5 years in prison after he received one of the longest sentences ever handed down in the state of Oklahoma. But as you'll see in our next story from 1997, Durham's lawyers turned back to the very same DNA evidence that helped convict him.
3,220 years.
You will never leave this prison, never be eligible for parole with that sentence.
True. 3,000 years in Oklahoma is equivalent to 70 and a half life sentences. Can anybody on earth do 70 and a half life sentences? No, they can't.
Tim Durham has barely made a dent in his time, convicted unjustly, he says, of a horrible crime. An 11-year-old girl, dressed for a pool party, waited in her home, nestled here among the lawns and shade trees of Maple Ridge, an affluent section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was late morning. Her parents were both at work when a stranger forced his way into the house and raped the young girl. She provided police with a clear description: a small man, 5'5", with red hair, who was clean-shaven. And the police had a picture in their file that was a perfect match. It was Tim Durham. Durham had been in trouble before. His convictions included driving under the influence, public drunkenness, burglary for stealing a vacuum cleaner, fraud for charging $70 on a friend's father's credit card without permission, and then he sold a gun at a pawn shop, a probation violation. Rather than serve a prison sentence, Durham jumped bail. 10 weeks after the assault, the child victim chose Tim Durham's photo from a group of police mugshots. Durham, she said, had raped her.
You were accused of having raped an 11-year-old little girl. Did you commit that crime?
No, I did not. There's no way I could have.
The victim was a very impressive person.
That's the way James Gill, the jury foreman, remembers the power of the 11-year-old's testimony.
She seemed to have her act together, and she was a very credible witness.
And she said it was Tim Durham, no doubt about it.
She was absolutely and totally positive. And the reason why I believed her is because she spent so much time with him.
And it wasn't just the word of a child. The jury was also presented with science that incriminated Tim Durham.
Do you remember the scientific testimony, the DNA testimony?
Yes, it's again a long time ago, but I do remember something about it, yes.
What the jury foreman says he remembers is that sperm collected from the crotch of the victim's bathing suit contained DNA, and that the expert said Durham was within 5% of the population with that kind of DNA. To the jurors, both the victim and the scientist seemed to point directly at Durham.
The jury deliberated for how many hours about?
9 hours, I believe it was. We thought the man was guilty. We all voted that he was guilty.
If he had done this deal, I would be the first, to say he did it. My son did not do this. He was in Dallas, Texas.
He was seen by all these witnesses that very morning. We're not talking about the next day they talked to him. We're talking about that morning.
And if you think this is just his parents, Eleanor and Jim, making up an alibi for him, think again. All these people say they saw Tim Durham in Dallas, some at the exact time, 11 a.m., that the rape occurred in Tulsa, 239 miles away.
Almost 9 o'clock, probably a couple minutes before. They drove up. Tim was driving.
He drove up with his father.
Timmy had on some loud clothes. The shoes rung a bell in my mind.
He was definitely in my house around 11 o'clock.
If you're all telling the truth, There's no way that Tim Durham could have committed this crime.
He couldn't have done it. Right.
That's the whole point.
And all of you testified.
Yes.
All of you testified.
I feel very sorry for that girl, but she's got the wrong man. And that happens more often than not with an eyewitness identification.
In fact, DNA science has shown that nearly 1 out of every 4 victim identifications in rape cases are wrong. But Tim Durham's case is different. Part of the evidence against him was a DNA test, but he still believes it is DNA that can set him free.
We're mad, and justifiably so. And we're really mad now that we've got DNA evidence in the state's hands, and they won't act on it.
That's right. Jim and Eleanor Durham have now done what their son's lawyer did not do. They hired a DNA expert. One of the most respected DNA scientists in the country tested the semen stain left by the rapist, this time using a more sophisticated technique not available when Durham went to trial.
He was able to show that that semen stain could not have come from the defendant in this case, which was Tim Durham.
I believe, based on this particular test, that the wrong man was accused and the wrong man was tried and the wrong man was convicted.
You might think that's the end of it. Good science prevails and Tim Durham gets to go home. But it's apparently not that simple for the prosecutor's office that sent Tim Durham to prison in the first place.
Does the DNA test result persuade you that the wrong man was convicted for this crime?
Not completely at this time, otherwise we would have joined in a joint application.
Bill LaFortune wasn't the Tulsa DA when Tim Durham was sent to prison, and he's not inclined to be the one who lets him out.
When the victim's family feels very strongly that despite the scientific evidence, they are still positive that it is Tim Durham who committed this crime, I have to take that in to consideration in my decision.
Why would you just sit neutrally by with your hands folded? I don't
So
understand.
I didn't have enough information, and still don't at this time, to be comfortable with that kind of a decision based on what I have. That is my position, and that's not going to change as a result of this interview today.
So Tim Durham is going to have to wait in his 4-by-6 foot cell until a judge agrees to hear the new DNA evidence.
In 1997, Tim Durham's sentence was overturned, and he walked out of prison a free man. Tulsa County District Attorney Bill LaFortune announced that he would not re-prosecute the case. Throughout the 1990s, 2 of Durham's attorneys, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, took on a number of cases like Durham's that involved DNA evidence.
That is the whole DNA from the individual.
The attorneys, who had gained national attention as part of O.J. Simpson's defense team,
How about that, Mr. Fung?
began a legal assistance program, the Innocence Project, to help people convicted of crimes challenge their convictions using DNA. Working out of Cardozo Law School in New York, the 2 lawyers and a small staff handle a heavy caseload with the help of law students. Mail floods in primarily from convicts or their family members eager to have a case reopened.
When there's been an exoneration or we're having publicity, we could easily get up to 100 letters a week.
The project handles only a fraction of these inquiries, providing free legal assistance as long as clients arrange to pay for the testing themselves. While attorneys and law enforcement officials can be reluctant to revisit a case 10 or 20 years old, Scheck said DNA testing is often the only way to see that justice is done.
The results are the results. Obviously, district attorneys who are using the technology to create evidence of guilt, I think, should be equally willing to let us test evidence in cases where people are claiming they're innocent. The DNA tests could prove once and for all whether they're innocent or guilty.
According to Scheck, by 1999, over 60 people in North America had been exonerated with post-conviction DNA testing. Scientific advances have only increased the use of DNA in criminal cases. Because of the overwhelming caseload, Scheck and Neufeld began working with law schools and attorneys around the country to build a network of local innocence projects.
I realize that we have an incredible opportunity here to fundamentally reform the entire system for the good. And DNA technology has assisted us in that, but it's the overall system that really needs reform, because what about all the cases where there's no biological evidence to do DNA testing? How sad can those be if in the cases that involve biological evidence, we see such an amazing rate of wrongful convictions.
Coming up on Justice Files, the power of eyewitness testimony versus the science of DNA. Our next story from 1998 is a tragic tale of rape, mistaken identity, DNA evidence, and mercy. It involved a woman victimized by a brutal crime and the man she identified as her assailant.
Late one night, Jennifer Thompson was the victim of a violent attack. Within days, she had to make a fateful choice that would later haunt her. Jennifer had to identify the man who raped her.
There was no doubt in my mind. He was the face of my nightmares.
That face belonged to Ronald Cotton. 2 trials, and years later, she knows what he always has. Jennifer was wrong. It was a steamy summer night in Burlington, North Carolina. Jennifer Thompson was a 22-year-old college student who lived alone here in the Brookwood Garden Apartments. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, she heard a noise by the side of her bed.
When I first woke up, I actually tried to go back to sleep. I was hoping that it was a nightmare, and so I actually tried to close my eyes again, and I heard the noise again, and I turned my head over to the side, and I said, "Who is it? Who's there?"
And did anyone answer?
No. He just jumped up from the side of the bed and straddled my hands and put the knife to my throat.
Jennifer knew she couldn't fight him. She was just 5'1", weighing 100 pounds. She tried to stay calm and to be smart.
So I just figured that since I couldn't fight, I would fight another way.
You would survive.
I would survive. Right?
And you would help catch him.
That was my intention, was to nail him to the wall.
Even as she was being raped, Jennifer summoned the strength to study her attacker. In the streetlight, through her bedroom blinds, she tried to memorize his face, his eyes, his hair. She spoke to him, gathering clues, winning his trust. After about half an hour, she convinced him to put down the knife and let her go to the kitchen to get something to drink. Wrapped only in a blanket, Jennifer saw her way out.
I was running the water, I was throwing ice cubes in my metal sink, I was opening up cabinets and drawers, making enough noise that while I was making the noise, I was slowly opening the door. And I just took that leap of faith and took a big breath of air and just ran.
Jennifer was taken to the hospital for a rape examination kit, a full-body search for blood, hair, or semen evidence. It was there that she learned her rapist had struck again, just an hour and a half later and less than a mile from her home. Jennifer felt more determined than ever to help police catch her attacker.
She made it very clear to me at the onset that she was going to get the guy that raped her. She made it her business to look at him well so that she'd be able to identify him later.
And she had the information to back it up.
Oh, yes, yes.
You know, he's an African-American male, he's in his early 20s. He had on a blue shirt with white stripes. He had on dark pants, like army fatigue, that I thought they were like army pants at the time. I could describe his shoes.
Jennifer's memory was soon put to the test. Feature by feature, she worked with police to create a composite sketch.
Did the eyes go up this way? Did they go down that way? Ears and eyelashes and nostrils, how the nostrils flare.
The sketch was posted all around Burlington. Police received information about 6 potential suspects, all with criminal records, all with photos on file with the police. 2 days after the crime, they called Jennifer in to do a photographic lineup.
So when you looked at the photos, did one of them stand out to you?
Mm-hmm.
Right away?
Yeah.
And whose was it?
It was Ronald Cotton's.
My mother boyfriend was standing on the front porch, and once I was about ready to enter the apartment, he told me, "Saran, the police were looking for you." And I asked him for what? And he told me for a rape.
Ronald Cotton was 22 years old and worked at a seafood restaurant near Jennifer's home. He borrowed a neighbor's car and drove to the police station to try and clear things up.
Were you a little nervous going over there, knowing that they suspected you of this very serious crime?
No, because I know I hadn't committed no crime.
Ronald Cotton had no way of knowing that drive down to the police station would be his last act as a free man for a long time. When he got there, he learned police had found shoes under his bed that matched the shoes that Jennifer described. The shoes were missing chunks of insole, similar to a piece of foam left behind by the rapist. Cotton's flashlight was identical to the one stolen from the second victim's car. And then there was his alibi. Cotton told police he was with friends the night of the rapes. His friends later denied it. And Cotton had a record. One conviction for breaking and entering, another for assault with intent to commit rape. Ronald Cotton was under arrest. The final test would be a physical lineup, a chance for the victims to see and hear their alleged attacker. Cotton and 6 randomly selected men were lined up, right across the room from Jennifer. Her memory was critical because the second victim hadn't gotten a good look at her attacker.
You were number 5.
Yes. They told me to step forward and say, "Hey, baby, how you doing? Shut up, I'll kill you." So I stated it, turned around, stepped back.
In January of 1985, in the Alamance County Courthouse, Ronald Cotton went on trial. With the circumstantial evidence and Jennifer's powerful testimony, it took a jury just a few hours to convict Cotton of first-degree burglary and first-degree rape. He was sentenced to life plus 50 years.
I was so relieved. I thought, this is it. It is over. I can move on with my life.
Cotton filed an appeal, but appeals take time. But as he waited in prison, Ronald Cotton made a crucial discovery. Another inmate arrived from the same town, also convicted of rape. Another tall, black man, a man Cotton thought looked very much like the sketch of Jennifer's rapist. That man was Bobby Poole.
I told him, I said, "You resemble the picture of the guy that committed the crime I'm in for." I said, "Did you do it?" And he said, "No."
But then later you heard some talk in the prison
Yes.
that Bobby Poole was going around to inmates and telling them that he, in fact, had raped Jennifer Thompson and a second woman that night, not you.
Yes.
Ronald Cotton wrote his lawyer.
"Mr. Mosley, there is no doubt in my mind that Bobby Poole did the crime I'm serving time for. I work in the kitchen here with him as well as sleep in the same dorm. Mr. Mosley, Poole is the one."
Police had not known about Bobby Poole at the time of Jennifer's rape, so his photo was not one of the 6 she saw, and he was not in the physical lineup. Jennifer never saw Bobby Poole and Ronald Cotton side by side until the fall of 1987, when Cotton was granted a new trial, and defense attorney Phil Mosley put Jennifer's memory to the test.
We had subpoenaed Bobby Poole into the courtroom, and at that time, both Jennifer and the second rape victim had an opportunity to see Bobby Poole, see Ronald Cotton right there with each other.
When you saw him, did you think maybe he's the man?
No.
Not even for a moment?
No. You have to realize this has been 3 years now. And Ronald Cotton's face had become a permanent fixture in my brain. He was the face of my nightmares. Every night, I couldn't go outside in the dark. I couldn't go from my bathroom to my bedroom alone in the dark.
And when you saw Bobby Poole,
I just thought, oh, this is another game. They're trying to throw me.
Both victims swore Cotton was their rapist. A second jury voted to convict. This time, Cotton got 2 life sentences, plus 54 years.
you had to go back to prison with Bobby Poole, a man you believed had really committed the crimes you were convicted of.
Yes.
How did you control yourself?
It was hard. I wanted to really hurt this guy. But my father, he told me, he said, no, he said, don't do it. He said, just let his conscience eat him, and eventually, you know, he'll confess.
Ronald joined the prison choir to lift his spirits. It seemed Ronald Cotton would live out his life behind bars.
Coming up on Justice Files, Ronald Cotton teaches himself the inner workings of DNA evidence. Ronald Cotton was convicted not once but twice of the same rape. The victim identified him, and she was certain her attacker was behind bars. Enter DNA technology.
10 years passed in prison, yet Ronald Cotton never stopped trying to prove his innocence. He watched the O.J. Simpson trial and learned about DNA testing, a technology that had not existed when he went to trial. Cotton got the attention of a University of North Carolina law professor, Rich Rosen. Cotton told Rosen he'd like to try DNA testing in his case.
My first reaction was to warn him that it could boomerang, that if in fact there was any chance his DNA could show up in that, he needed to understand that this could destroy any chance he would have for a new trial and eventual freedom. Once he said he wanted to go ahead with it, then I was willing to try, though I was still very skeptical of the possibility of finding anything to test.
But back at the Burlington Police Department, sitting on a shelf in the evidence room, was a paper bag with the now 10-year-old evidence. Inside the rape kit of the second victim, on one of the vaginal swabs, scientists were able to isolate a tiny fragment of sperm that they could test against Cotton's DNA. The results confirmed what he had been saying all along. The DNA did not match. Ronald Cotton was an innocent man. The lab obtained samples of Bobby Poole's DNA and found a match. Science proved Poole had raped the second victim. But in Jennifer's case, they couldn't find any sperm to test. So Mike Galden returned to the prison, hoping to get answers from Bobby Poole.
I think he saw that it was of no value to continue to deny it. He laid out both sexual assaults, how they occurred in the right order, how he entered the respective residences, how he found the victims.
He knew details only the rapist would know.
That's right.
You knew that day, 11 years after Ronald Cotton went to prison, that you had the wrong man.
Exactly.
How did you feel?
Terrible.
Why were you so sure it was Ronald Cotton for all those years?
Because he looked like the man who raped me. And the more I saw him and the more we got physical evidence, it just all was, yeah, this is the man. And he doesn't have an alibi. You know, your mind starts telling you, you're right. See, you were right.
On June 30th, 1995, Ronald Cotton walked out of the Alamance County Courthouse a free man.
It was a good feeling. I looked up and said, thank God.
Slowly, carefully, Ronald Cotton set out to rebuild his life. He got a job working in the warehouse of LabCorp, the company that performed the test that set him free. He fell in love with a co-worker and got married. But while Ronald Cotton flourished, Jennifer fell apart. She couldn't sleep. She sat and cried for hours at a time. Jennifer knew there was something she had to do.
The guilt got so heavy, and the nightmares were still there.
You knew you had to see him?
I had to see him.
Jennifer wanted to meet face to face with the man who for years had haunted her. She called Mike Galden and asked him to arrange a meeting with Ronald Cotton and his wife.
Did you ever consider saying no?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Because there was a lot of unanswered questions lingering in my head. I just wanted to hear what she had to say.
On a cool spring evening at a church not far from where the rape occurred, Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton met. For the first time, not as accuser and accused, but as two human beings. Not as victim and rapist, but as people who needed to speak.
I kept thinking, what do I call him? Do I call him Mr. Cotton? Do I call him Ronald Cotton? Do I call him Ronald? Do I say, I'm so sorry? What do I say? I mean, is he going to slap me? Is his wife going to slap me? I just prayed. I prayed that I would have the strength to do it. I didn't know that I could. I really didn't.
You had convinced yourself for a very long time that he was your rapist. Was there a tiny part of you that was maybe a little still afraid of him?
But that was even more important for me to see him. Because I didn't want to be afraid of him. I knew I didn't need to be afraid of him.
Well, she put our hands together, and she looked at me, looked at my wife, And she said, Ronald, I just want to tell you how sorry I am for causing you to go through what you did. There isn't a day that doesn't go by to where I couldn't look at you and tell you how sorry that I am.
He said, I don't hate you. He says, I've never hated you. I forgive you. And I want you to have a good life, and I want to have a good life.
She cried. My wife, she cried, and just about made me cry. But, you know, I said, well, I can't break down like this, you know. But even though I wanted to, you know, I just held back.
Both Jennifer and Ronald look back at that meeting as a day that transformed their lives. Jennifer says the shame has lifted and her nightmares have finally stopped. Ronald says it was as if something locked inside him had been set free. They both marvel that two people who were once each other's worst enemy now consider themselves friends.
Do you now feel indebted to the man you once hated?
Ronald Cotton has allowed me to ask for forgiveness. That is a gift. That is a gift that he gave to me. Yes, I feel very grateful to him. I really do. I think he's an amazing human being.
Coming up on Justice Files, DNA evidence so convincing it grabs a governor's attention, and a DNA database. In 1999, Ronald Cotton had built a new home in North Carolina and was continuing to rebuild his life. A year earlier, he and his wife became the parents of a baby girl. Cotton's case is just one of many in which eyewitness testimony was contradicted by DNA testing. In 1999, John Willis walked out of prison 9 years after he was convicted of raping 2 women in a Chicago beauty parlor, sentenced to 100 years in prison for a crime he did not commit.
Feel good. I'm gonna go see my little daughter. I ain't seen her since she was 5 months old. She's 9.
Although eyewitnesses swore he was the attacker, DNA tests revealed Willis had nothing to do with one of the 2 attacks in Chicago, so a judge released him on his own recognizance. The second charge was later dropped as well, and another suspect was identified. He was Dennis Magruder, who was then serving a 40-year sentence after pleading guilty to 5 sexual assaults. Willis's attorney said the same DNA evidence that exonerated Willis positively linked Magruder to the crimes.
It's hurt to be locked up for something to do.
Eyewitness testimony also helped convict Kevin Bird of rape. He spent over a decade in prison before DNA helped set him free.
There is a God. You know, that's what I felt. You know, I felt that God answered my prayer.
The test shows that the semen deposited at the time of the assault could not have emanated from this particular defendant, that he is not our defendant. He is not the one that committed the assault.
The Board of Pardons and Paroles, the prosecutors, and even the judge unanimously recommended a pardon for Mr. Bird, believing his accuser, the woman who was raped and who continued to stand by her story, was mistaken. In 1997, Texas Governor George W. Bush declined to grant the pardon, arguing that the courts should determine in a hearing whether the new DNA test results are admissible and warrant a new trial. Bird's attorney called the decision misguided.
If you're not going to pardon an innocent man who was locked up wrongfully for 12 years, who are you going to pardon?
In October 1997, after a state court judge ruled that DNA evidence proved Bird innocent, Bush granted Bird a full pardon. The use of DNA testing has dramatically transformed the way police investigations are conducted. As the technology has become more and more advanced, some law enforcement officials have pushed for a national database of DNA information taken from every person arrested. In 1999, all 50 states were collecting DNA samples from at least some members of their prison population. The FBI had established a national computer database containing the DNA profiles of 250,000 convicted felons.
It could be the most critical tool that is on the horizon for the next century.
New York City Police Commissioner Howard Safer proposed that police take DNA samples from every person who gets arrested, whether or not they are convicted of a crime. Just as with fingerprints and mugshots, he said, a pool of DNA information could help catch repeat offenders.
I think it will help because many of the people who are arrested for minor crimes are involved in major crimes. We've proven that in New York over and over.
But civil libertarians responded that such a broad plan could end up putting too much private information in the hands of the state.
It's clearly an invasion of privacy. DNA holds the most important secrets of our life. It can tell us everything from parentage to health problems or predictors of health problems. There are even, unfortunately, people out there who think it can predict future criminal tendencies or aggression or mental illness.
But it's really no different than a fingerprint because, the civil libertarians are concerned we're going to use it to tell people's hair color, their diseases, their family backgrounds. That's not at all what this proposal is about. We have to make sure the proper safeguards are in place, that nobody's rights are violated, that if you're not convicted or if you're not prosecuted, that the data is expunged and the sample is destroyed. But I think it's very important for the future of policing.
Civil libertarians fear the proposed safeguards would not do enough.
I'm very fearful that we're headed towards the brave new world of genetic determinism, where everybody is what their genetic makeup suggests they are, and that over time, the pressure on government and the pressure on private industry to use this data that's being collected will simply mount. It'll become impossible to resist it, and we're all going to be fated to be whatever our genes suggest that we are.
DNA evidence is a powerful tool in the courtroom, but it can also be dangerous. Here's Professor Arthur Miller to explain why.
In a courtroom, DNA is just another piece of evidence, but we have to acknowledge that it's a very powerful piece of evidence, and its growing use presents serious concerns. There is, of course, the danger that it will replace common sense, that the DNA will be equated with truth. DNA is only as good as the quality of the scientists who handle and evaluate it. And unless these people are subject to rather strict standards and very competent cross-examination, you could have things that are wrong slide right through. Also, because DNA appears to be more infallible than other forms of evidence, we should worry about falsification. We know, for example, of many instances in which police have lifted fingerprints and placed them on a crime scene because they were convinced that this was the guy who did it. Well, why couldn't you do that with DNA? The law is a system in which human beings determine guilt or innocence on the basis of probability. Used properly, DNA can become a powerful tool in improving the accuracy of courtroom determinations, whether the accused is guilty, or just as important, whether he is innocent.
I'm Jay Shadler. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of Justice Law.